Today's daf is daf Dalid, and we'll start with Omer of Yossi Bar Ovin, which is the fourth line down from the top. Itamer of Yossi Bar Zvida. Mashal to Sumchus Lamad Dome. Right, Sumchus was of the opinion that if a person mistakenly, inadvertently violated a chiyuv kares, like for example, he ate chelev because he thought, based on the ruling of the Bezdin, the erroneous ruling of the Bezdin, that it would be permissible to eat that chelev. And the truth is that he is not totally guiltless here, even though he relied on Bezdin, because he could have found out, had he done a little bit more due diligence, that Bezdin rescinded and revoked their original position, having realized that they made a mistake. And therefore, the question is, should he be obligated to bring what's called an Asham Tolui, which is a carbon that's brought for someone whose violation is ambiguous? Like, for example, we don't know between two pieces of meat, and he mistakenly might have eaten the chalev instead of what he thought was shuman. So he brings that carbon called an asham tolu. Now, Sulchus is of the opinion that he does not bring an asham tolu. And the Gemara is now looking for a mashal to give us like sort of a model that we would understand Sulchus's approach. So that model is Odom Shehevi Kaparosa Ben Hashmoshos. Somehow, mistakenly, during a period of Ben Hashmoshos, which is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, he brought his carbon, and therefore Safek Mod Yom, if indeed the carbon made it through before nightfall, before, let's say, sunset, then this capolo, he did achieve kapara. But Safek, there's a possibility that Mishachashecha, that they brought the carbon after nightfall, and therefore he would not achieve kapara because there's no avoda kshera at night. And yet, in this case of a suffix, because we don't know if he had achieved kapara, he had not achieved kapara, he should be bringing at least an asham tolu, and ein mevi asham tolu. He does not bring an asham tolu. Now, we'll never ever know what the status of Bein Hashmoshos is, because Bein Hashmoshos is a period of time when the sun begins to set, but it hasn't yet set below the horizon. And this is like an inherent suffix. And perhaps we could go a step further and say that, although there's no question about the fact that, this was not, proper, there was some, element here of sin in the fact that this carbon was brought in that period of time, which is suffix. But nevertheless, we sort of justify the ambiguity here about the nature of Ben Hashmosh to such an extent that we say he doesn't even have to bring a carbon asham tolu. And so too here, in the case of a shogeg b'chiyuv kares, where he ate chelev and he was relying on the Bezdin and their ruling, which was a mistaken ruling, but there still is an element of guilt here in the fact that he didn't do his complete research to find out, hey, why are they bringing a carbon asham tolu? There must have been a reversal of the court decision, but he didn't. He didn't entertain the possibility that Bezdin made a mistake. It wasn't on his mind. So in that case, like the case of Ben Hashmoshos, he doesn't even bring a carbon asham tolu. That's the shita of Slomi boy lamandi omer bezdin meviyim. Now, look, if it's a case where we accept one particular opinion in a great controversy about who brings the par helim dovashal tzibur, and that opinion is that it's the bezdin that brings the carbon asham totally. So it's not a public knowledge, it's not something that's accessible to the public. Lo ifarsam milsa. And therefore, we can dumb down the element of guilt here and exempt him from an Oshim Toli Ella. Now, according to the other opinion, that it's not the Bezdin that brings the Karban Oshim Toli, but the Karban Helim, Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur, but rather it's the Tzibur themselves. So we make a collection from the members of the community to raise the money for this Karban. And therefore, it's mefarsam milsa. It's something public in nature. Like he really should have wondered, why are they collecting, all this money for bringing this Karban? What kind of Karban is it? Normally a Karban tzibur is brought from the funds of the Trumas Halishka. But here we're collecting the funds from the public, and it was really very close, for him to find out and discover that this was a Karban that's brought because Bezdin made a mistake. Hava minanle, we could have said to him that, if you would have just asked and inquired about the nature of this Karban and why we're raising the funds to bring this Karban tzibur, you would have found out that Bezdin made a mistake in there, and you never would have eaten the chela. The hacha, but yet, we're going to compare it to the case where he doesn't know if the kapara was brought while it was still light before the sun actually set or after the sun set. And ishoil lo ishkach inish to mishaylet. Now, maybe what the Gemara is saying here is maybe he didn't even entertain the possibility that he should be asking about whether the great court, the Sanhedrin Agdola, made an error in their judgment. So in that sense, to say that he should really bring a karban for eating chelev, like normally if you violate an Isa kares, like eating chelev b'shogeg, you bring a chatas, but in a suffix situation where we're not sure, we substitute that with a karban osham toli. But here, we're not even going to say that he would have been chayav a karban chatas. He never would have been chayav a karban chatas to begin with, because he, in a sense, justifiably what's the word I'm using? Relied on the decision of the Beis Nagol. Now, Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah also reflects the same idea, and he says that the violator of achilas chelev b'shogeg does not have to bring a karban osham because he relied on Bezdin, and then Ben Azai sort of attacked Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva made the following distinction. Rabbi Akiva postulated that it depends where he's located. If he's still at home, then we have reason to say, well, you're guilty because you were local in town and you could have found out by asking people whether Bezdin's ruling is still valid, or maybe they determined that it was erroneous, it was mistaken, and they rescinded it. He could have easily asked that question and inquired, and therefore he's guilty for eating chelev without doing his due diligence, as we said. But says Rabbi Akiva, if he is on a trip and he's far away from his local location, there's no one there in the Far East where he's doing, he's buying trinkets. Nobody there's going to tell him whether Bezdin rescinded their decision. Then, of course, he wouldn't inquire. There's no one to inquire from. So comes along Ben Azai, and Ben Azai attacks Rabbi Akiva. He says, "Ma'ishno min hayoshev." What difference does it make whether he's sitting at home or he's on his way? In any case, he should be somewhat accountable for not inquiring before he went ahead and ate the chelev. So Rabbi Kiva says, wait a minute, what do you mean, Ben Azai? What are you talking about? He was, at the end of the world. There was no way he could inquire and clarify. So why do you hold him accountable? So therefore the Gemara asks, Shapir ka'amale Rabbi Akiva leBen Azai. Rabbi Akiva's response to Ben Azai was so obvious, and you really begin to wonder why a scholar of the nature of Ben Azai and his status would have failed to understand the difference between the case of a man who's local and he could ask anyone on the street why am I eating chalev? I'm about to eat chalev. Are Bezdin really serious about that, or did they realize that they made an error? As opposed to someone who's in the Far East, who's he going to ask? Amarafa, the machlokus between Ben Azai and the back and forth between Ben Azai and Rabbi Kiva is on a much more subtle scenario. Hechzik b'derech ikabenayim. The machlokus here is about a case where he hasn't yet traveled to the Far East. He packed his bags and he's on his way out, but he's still within the environs of the city. LeBen Azai chayev. Ben Azai holds, wait a minute, right now he's in his local town. He hasn't yet left. Is therefore he's chayev. He has to bring this carbon. We called it an osham tolui because there is an element of guilt. He should have done more research. He's still in his house. Rabbi Akiva potter da hichzik b'derech. Rabbi Akiva has this new concept called hichzik b'derech. He's already set out on his road. He's got his knapsack on his back. He's got his, his cards. His, whatever he needs to get on the boat. And already he's in a different mindset. He's far away from here, even though he's still physically here. He's on the way. His mind is not in any way focused on, should I do more diligence and investigate the status of the Psak of Bezdin? He's already on the way. Okay. Horulo Bezdin Lakar Eskolag. All right, this is the main topic of our daf for today, for the sugya. And the Mishnah makes a distinction between two types or categories of error on the part of the Bezdin. One category is where they deny an entire Isur in the Torah. There is no Isur Shabbos. There is no Isur Nida. There is no Isur Avodah Zarah. They deny the whole thing. Now, such a mistake is not really called a mistake. There are limits to the concept of tos, where we could, so to speak, justify, well, the Bezdin erroneously thought X. They couldn't have thought, and we cannot justify that they ripped out a parsha, a mitzvah of the Torah. However, if they only remove miktsas, a part of that mitzvah, like, for example, instead of saying there's no Shabbos, they'll tell people, well, we came to a ruling, we decided, we took a vote in the Sanhedrin, we came to the conclusion that 38 out of 39 malachas are prohibited on Shabbos, but carrying from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, that's mutter. Then they bring a carbon par helim davar tzib. Ton Rabbanan. The pasuk says v'nelam davar. Now, nelam davar means what was missing to them, what was obscured from their vision was davar. Davar means some little part of it, or some segment of it. V'lo sheyakar mitzvah kula. But the Torah is telling us that if they undermined an entire mitzvah, that's not considered a tos, and that Bezdin is held so responsible for making such a gross error that it's not called an error at all. It's almost as if they deliberately decided to rip out Shabbos from the Torah. Ketzad. Now, one of the cases, as I mentioned, was Nida. So, Amrulay Nida by Torah, if they took out the entire parsha of Nida and they said there's no Isur Nida, or alternatively, Shabbos by Torah, Ein Avodas Kol Chav by Torah, I might think Yachal Yu Chayav, and maybe you could somehow justify that as an error that's still considered within the margins of feasible toyos, and therefore to toes, and therefore there should be a chiyuv of par helim davar shel tzibur. Talmud lomer v'nevar davar. Now, again, it doesn't say vanilla mitzvah min Torah, as if to say they overlooked an entire mitzvah in the Torah, but davar. Davar means, a part of, a segment of a mitzvah. V'lo teshisali mitzvah kula, but if they completely permit and uproot a mitzvah min Torah, then harei l'pturin, there's no chiyuv of a par helim davar shel tzibur. Aval amar yesh nida b'Torah. Aval haba al shomeres yom kedeged yom patur. And I believe that we touched on this yesterday, right? Because it does, right? It does appear in the Mishnah on Daf Gimel Amid Beis. So we touched on this, that if a woman sees one day during her Yud Aleph Yemei Ziva, then she's what's called the Zava Katana. She doesn't need a full 7 days. She needs 1 day of Naki. And that's called Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. For that day that she saw a Re'iyah of Dam Nidus, she needs a day of Shmira, of Naki, of day that she did. Now, if he has a relationship with her before that Yom Naki passes, then it's the same as violating the Isur Nida. Came along the Bezdin and they paskin that you're allowed to have a relationship during that period of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, even before that day of Naki passed. Alternatively, Yesh Shabbos B'Torah Aval Motzim Rishus HaYachal Rishus HaRabim Potter. There's no malach of hotzah in the case where you are taking something from a private domain out into a public domain. Yesh avodas kol chav b'Torah. They're not uprooting the entire entity of avodas kol chav, but aval mishtach ve'poter. But to bow down to an idol, that's okay. It's Talmud Lomer v'nelam davar lo kol haguf. So in all these cases where they left the guf itself intact, but they just were nelam davar, only a part of it, they're chayev, and then there's a carbon par helim davar shel tzibur that's brought either by the bezdin or by the tzibur. That's a great controversy. But if they were oker the entire guf, then that's not called v'nelam davar, and there's no chiyuv par helim davar shel tzibur. It's not a toast, it's not a shogeg, it's like a mezu. Omar mar yachal yu pturim. I don't understand the language of the brisa, the logic of the brisa. That's the Gemara's analyzing. The brisa seems to indicate that maybe even in a case where they said miktas is batel, they were vatel miktas, like the Shomeres Yom or the Hotzami, even in that case, maybe there's no par helim davar shel tzibur Talmud Loma. But before the Talmud Loma, there's got to be some logic that necessitates that Talmud Loma, that pasuk. Now, the Gemara asks the following: if in the Havamina kiyum b'mikzas ubitul mixas is potud, and for sure it goes without saying that akiris kol aguf, they deny the whole parsha of Shabbos is potud. It's b'may chayovim. When did the Torah say, under what circumstances is there a par helim davar shel tzibur? You leave no room for the chiyuv of the par. Tana hachi kukash. Gemara says that this is what the havamin of the Tana was. Ema davar kula milsa b'mashma. Maybe the word davar refers to the entire mitzvah, and therefore the only time in which the Torah is saying v'nelam davar and they have to bring the par is only when they removed an entire parsha in the Torah. Talmud Lomer, therefore, I need the pasuk v'nelam davar, and we're going to learn that v'nelam davar somehow, we'll have to see how, means only part of the mitzvah. My mashma, how do you see that? Omer Ula krei be v'nelam mi davar. You take the mem at the end of the word v'nelam, and you could attach it to the very next word of davar, and then you read it as mi davar. Mi davar means part of it, but not the entire entity. Chizkiyavar, he has an alternative way of understanding how we derive this conclusion. Amakra v'asu achas mikol mitzvos. Now, the word mikol means amongst them or part of them. Mikol mitzvahs will kol mitzvahs, but not if they uproot an entire mitzvah in the Torah. So the Gemara now rejects Chizkiah. It says mikol mitzvos. Now the word mitzvos is tartei mashma. It's in the plural, and the minimum of a plural is always two. So that would mean that according to the implication of the plural word mitzvos, they, meaning the Bezdin, transgressed one of many mitzvos. Right? Mikol mitzvos. So it doesn't mean that they transgressed part of one mitzvah, but rather they transgressed or permitted two mitzvos. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mitzvahs ksiv. So there's what's called a kri and a ksiv. We may read it as mitzvos in the plural, but what it says in the letters of the Torah is mitzvahs, which is in the singular. Rav Ashi has a third opportunity to derive the conclusion that the Bezdin, if they were oker an entire mitzvah, there's no par helim davar, whereas if they are oker, if they mavatel part of a mitzvah, there is on. Yolif davar mizakin mam. So we have a Gzeira Shava from the parsha of par helim davar shel tzibur, and the pasuk says davar in Zaken Mamre, right? The rebellious scholar. Again, the word davar. Ma mamre min davar v'lo kol davar. So we have in the pasuk it says mi davar, right? Min davar, and that excludes kol davar. For ra here also no ras tos of bezdin for parahel davar shel tzibur davar v'lo kol aguf. Right, they only permitted some part of the mitzvah, but not the entire entity of the mitzvah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel ein bezdin chayovim ad sheyoru b'dover she'ein hatzdukim morim bo. Al b'dover she'hatzdukim modim bo p'turim. My time was zil kori beirab. So comes along Shmuel and he adds another limiting, restricting condition for the chiyuv of parahel davar shel tzibur. They can't be denying something that's obvious, that's something that's explicit in the Torah. It's so explicit in the Torah that even the tzdukim who deny Torah Sheval Peh, and they're totally committed only to Torah Sheval Sav, to the written Torah, and even they accept that it's prohibited. If in that case Bezdin, makes a mistake and an erroneous ruling on something that's explicit, then the Gemara uses this this proverbial phrase, "Zil kari beirav." This is something that any child in cheder, he could be 5 years old, he would know the answer. So therefore, if Bezdin is going to come along, says Shmuel, and say that that which is explicit in the Torah is mutter, then that's not within the purview of tos. As we said before, the halacha of parahel davar shel tzibur is because of a tos. This is not a justifiable tos. Even the tzdukim will be moda that it's also. They came along and permitted it, and even a school child will know that it's also. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. When is there a chiyuv of bezdin of parahel davar yesh nida b'Torah? They admit that there's nida. They accept nida. Are you implying, therefore, according to Shmuel's principle, that the Stukim would deny the Easter of Shomeres Yom Kedeged Yom. V'amai Shomeres Yom Kedeged Yom Aksiva. It's in the pasuk. It says v'sofra Allah Melamid shesoferes echad liechad. So in the parsha of Zava, the Torah says she has to count for herself, and we learn from this that she counts one day, Yom Naki, for the one day that she saw during Yemei Aziva. So if that be the case, then even the Tzdukim will have to admit that there is an Isur Nida of Shomeres Yom Kedeged Yom. And yet, I don't understand how the Mishnah says that if they deny Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, then they bring the carbon Helim Dov Shel Tzibah. According to Shmuel, that's something that even the Tzdukim know about. It's explicit in the Pasuk. So now the Gemara is going to try a few different options to understand what the Bezdin was saying about the Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. And all these options are based on the premise that Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom is not the original mainstay Isur Nida. It's like an extension of Nida, and it might have different halachic rules. For example, Tiamri Hara Sharia. Hara means Tchilas Bia, before the actual penetration, just like the two organs touch. And the Torah doesn't say, I'm just telling you the Havmi, the Gemara is going to reject what I'm saying, but the Torah doesn't say that that's considered Bia, and therefore the Bezdin came to the conclusion that in Shomeres Yom Kedeged Yom, which, as I said, is sort of like a secondary offshoot of the primary Nida, then Hara is Mutter. And only Gmar Bia, the complete Bia, is prohibited. So Gemara rejects this. This is also something that the Tzdukim would have certainly admitted that Hara is also, because in the Parsha of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom of Zava Ketana, it says, Es Mekora Hera. Hera means the Tchiles Bia. He's exposed her private parts. So therefore the Gemara has to come up with an alternative. What does the Mishnah mean when they were matir Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom? Diamri Kedarka Asir Shalom Kedarka Shari. So there are two categories of Bia that the Torah prohibited. One is called Kedarka the normal way, and the other is Shalom Kedarka through the back. And this mistaken Bezdin, came to the conclusion that with regard to the secondary Isur Nida of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, the Torah only prohibited the normal Bia from the front and not Bia through the anus. So that Shalom Kedarka was not prohibited in Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. One says, what are you talking about? Haksiv. This is something that we can derive from the pasuk itself, and the Tzdukim would therefore have to accept it. Mishkevei Isha. Mishkevei Isha means that there are two ways in which he penetrated into her body, whether it was from the front or from the back. So that's also the pasuk, and therefore it's something that Tzdukim would accept, and therefore the Bezdin should be part of. And the answer is the Amri Kedarka Osra Afilu Hara Shalo Kedarka Gmar Bihu Di Osra Aval Hara Shari. They ruled that if it's a double negative, if I could use that term, and it was Shalom Kedarka with Hara, so it was Shalom Kedarka with just the male organ, came in contact with the orifice in the back. That in the case of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, or maybe even in the case of a Nida Mamish, would not generate an Isur. And that's already beyond Torah Shebechsav. That's already, juggling. The Torah says, Mishkevei Isha even Shalo Kedarka. And the Torah says, Es Makora Hera, even Tchilas Bia, even Hara. Now I put them together, and that's already an issue that Torah Shebal Peh has to address, and therefore, if the Bezdin Paskin, they ruled erroneously that if it's Shalom Kedarka and it's only Hara, then it's mutter, and that's something that in the Parsha of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, is already in the realm of Torah Shebal Peh, where the Tzdukim would question it. Frekta Gemara I Hachi Afilu Nida Nami. What's the Gemara bothered by a filu nami? Right, if the mistake was about Shalok Kedarko with Hara, then that could have been even a nida. Why did the Mishnah have to say Shomer Yom Keneged Yom? El Yolam Kedarko. Let's go back to our original assumption that they made a mistake about a normal, regular, classic beer. The Amri Harabi Isha Dava Udiksiva. The pasuk of Es Mekora Hera, which means even Tchilas Bia is prohibited. That pasuk appears in the parsha of Nida, but it doesn't necessarily spill over and apply to the parsha of Shomer Yom Keneged Yom, which, as we said over and over again, is like an extension. I have another possibility in interpreting our Mishnah, the Amri Zava Lo Havya Ela B'Yamamid. If she saw the dam during daylight hours, then she could become a Zava, meaning a Zava Ketana, which means Shomer Yom Keneged Yom. Tichsiv Kol Yimei Zova. So the pasuk emphasizes Yimei, and very often Chazal interpret that the word Yimei means during the daylight hours, but not at night. So here in the note here, he quotes Rabbeinu Chananel, who says that according to the final conclusion of the Gemara that we're talking about day as opposed to night, that's something that could apply to Nida as well. So the Mishnah didn't have to mention Shomer Yom Keneged Yom. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Yesh Shabbos B'Torah, V'al Amotzi Mishus L'Shus Potter. Is that something that the Tzdukim could agree to, and they would permit carrying from a private domain into a public domain? The Torah says, again, it's a pasuk in Tanakh, but this pasuk in Tanakh is a Gili Milsa to tell me what the Torah means when it prohibits hotzah. Lo totziu masa mibatechem. That you shall not carry out a burden from your house on Shabbos. Pasuk in Yomi. So the Gemara therefore thinks that based on this pasuk, since the Tzdukim accepted all of Tanakh, they would have agreed that you're not allowed to carry from one domain to another. And therefore, according to Shmuel's principle that there's no par helim davashal tzibur, in a case where the Tzdukim would agree that Bezdin made a toast when they permitted something which the Torah prohibited, then how could the Mishnah say that the Bezdin, if they made a mistake about Hotzah, would be chayiv of par helim davashal tzibur? It's something that even the Tzdukim would realize is a mistake. And the answer is the Amri. What did the court decide? That Hotzahu diyasach nasa muter. Enochinami, to take something from Rishus HaYachid and bring it out to Rishus HaRabim, that is prohibited because that's a profound action. You take something that's not accessible to the public and you make it publicly accessible. But if they paskin, but if a person wants to take something from Rishus HaYachid, from Rishus HaRabim, and bring it into a Rishus HaYachid, to a private domain, that's mutter, because that, on the contrary, is kind of lowering the accessibility of the object. And according to this answer, the Gemara thinks that the Tzdukim would also learn that when it says lo totziu mibatechem, it means hotzah from Rishus HaYachid out to Rishus HaRabim. But in the case of Achnasa, that could be mutter. So the Tzdukim would therefore agree and perhaps justify the mistaken ruling of the Bezdin, and therefore the chayav a korban helim davar tzibur. Same as another answer is the Amri Hotzah hu diasira, but moshid v'zorek shari. That the Torah in the pasuk in Yirmiyah indicates that Hotzah means carrying it, But in two other cases, for example, you throw it from one rishus to the other, or moshit, which during the Machnas Halavim they used to pass over the krushim from one oil to another through rishus harabim, and that's called moshit, and that's a tolda of meleches hotzah, but it's not explicit, and the tzdukim deny it, and therefore the bezin is chai. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, yesh avodas kol chabatorah mishtachva potvar mai. Hamishtachva haksiva. I mean, even the tzdukim would understand that the Bible prohibits bowing down to an idol. The siv lo tishtachva le'elecher. Torah is pretty outspoken about that. So why would the Bezdin be chayev korban parhel and dovishal tzibur in this case? I think Moritz is the Amri. What they said was ki asirish tachava kedarka. Every idol, every idolatry has its kedarka, the way it's normally worshipped. So that the Sadducees would say that if you're worshiping the idol the way it's normally worshipped, then you're in violation of idolatry. But if, let's say, hishtachava is not the way that you normally would serve the idol, for example, let's say it's poratzel pe'er or zorik avin, but not hishtachava, they would say that, okay, in that case, maybe the Torah didn't prohibit it. And that's called Shelo Kedarka Sharia. That's the ruling, the mistaken ruling of the Bezdin, that Shelo Kedarka, if hishtachva is not the normal, acceptable, common way that you worship that particular idol, then it's mutter. And that is something that the tzdukim could justify such a mistake, and therefore Bezdin in this case is chayav parhel and dovshel tibur. We're saying the third answer, the amri ishtachva gufa kedarka hu di asir, the isbeit pishut yodayim v'raglayim. There are two ways of doing ishtachava. There's the real McCoy way, and then there's, like a secondary way. The real way is called pishut yodayim v'raglayim, where you prostrate yourself on the floor, completely prostrated. Right? You are vertical on the floor. You are horizontal on the floor. But ishtachava, when you stand and you bow, that is permitted. And that's something which even the tzdukim could justify because it's not explicit in the Torah.